So I'm actually going to talk today about a few sort of related projects, related in the same way that I can tell a cohesive narrative about my research, but not completely. And not specifically the law-related stuff, in part because I don't yet have students who are interested in law at all, but maybe someday. But I will say before I get started, just also in case you want to talk to me about any of these things at some point, these are some general types of work that I do, stuff around online communities and governance, social norms, research ethics, which I'm talking about today, public perceptions of technology ethics, ethics education, and then a little bit at the end about marginalized online communities and fandom platforms in particular. So some ethical controversies that you probably have heard about. Every time I give a talk like this, there's more. I have a couple of what I say my hills to die on when it comes to ethics. One is about research ethics for public data, and one is about ethics education, and then a preview of some new research that I'm doing that I think is particularly exciting about marginalized communities and computational projects. So you might be wondering, what is ethics? This is a really good question and one that I'm not going to try to answer for you today, but I can give you one wrong answer, and a wrong answer to this question is that this is what the IRB tells you that you can do. I have a lot of feelings about IRBs, and this question in particular, and I'm not saying that IRBs are bad, I'm just saying that our IRBs are not the arbiters of what's ethical. And in part because a lot of the research ethics controversies that we're seeing lately look a lot more like these kinds of things. So examples of using publicly available data in research. So these are just a few examples. OkCupid, the AI mentioned here is also from dating sites, YouTube videos, etc. So I've been involved in work about research ethics for these kinds of things. So I am part of the SIG-Chi research ethics community, or the committee. I've been running workshops at various conferences on this for a few years, and I'm part of a big project to study these things empirically. And every time I finish one of these workshops or a panel or whatever about research ethics, we end up with this list of open questions, and I haven't changed this slide in about 4 years. These questions don't tend to ever close. And I'm not going to read them to you. This is more for effect. But things around use of public data in terms of consent and privacy and expectations and deleted data and all of these kinds of things. And one of the reasons that this has been a problem is because we have this idea that research ethics is governed by IRBs. And this is, kind of how we're taught, and that's how we think about research ethics. But the problem is that IRBs only care about human subjects. They're about regulation, right? So the reason that they exist is because federally funded research is covered by US law, and this is what the law is. It covers human subjects, which means either direct intervention with humans or collection of identifiable private information. So what does not fall into either of these categories is, for example, your photo on a publicly available dating site or a tweet. And so what we hear a lot in terms of these kinds of projects is that, oh, the data was already public. And one of my collaborators has a Google alert for this phrase because it's so common. And in fact, this phrase, which also was the subtitle of a paper that he published in 2010, this is Michael Zimmer, is actually the exact phrase that was used to justify the scraping of all of OkCupid and release of the data set publicly, was that the data was already public. Of course, still pretty easy then to take this data set and apply it to real people. And if any of you have ever used OkCupid, you know what kind of data is on OkCupid because you answer lots of very, very personal questions on that site. So this is something that people have been thinking about, but mostly kind of grumbling about in the hallways for a while, or sometimes complaining about in the reviews of papers. And so one of the things that I thought was, okay, we're researchers, like why aren't we researching this problem? So one of the things that I wanted to start with was, well, how is this kind of research actually perceived by the people who are in the data? Because it's not just data, right? Like a tweet is not a piece of data in the same way that like a measurement of the weather is. It's people. And so one of the first studies that I did in this space was to find out how Twitter users feel about tweets in research. And this was a paper that I wrote with Nick Preferis, who is at University of Kentucky. This was through a survey of Twitter users recruited from Mechanical Turk. And I will go ahead and address the massive obvious bias in this study, which is that people who don't like research probably are not going to participate in my research study about how they feel about research. And we actually thought when we did this, okay, well, we're going to, run it. And then if we do the data analysis and everyone is like, yeah, awesome, we love research, then we're just not going to publish it and there's like $600 down the drain. But it turns out that that was not the case. So I actually expect that the situation is even worse. That is what is reflected in this data. And we weren't interested in answering the question, like, should researchers use tweets or not? Because I have no intention of telling the research community that we shouldn't be using public data. There's actually a lot of really important research that's happening. But I'm going to get to what I think is the way that we should be using it or thinking about it. So first finding, most people have no idea that this is a thing that can happen. I actually think that the number is probably a little higher than this because Mechanical Turkers are at least kind of familiar with research. Anecdotally, I talk to a lot of people about my work, and often the reaction is, why would scientists care about my tweets? So this does not surprise me. It turns out also that almost half thought that this isn't allowed. Like, oh, clearly they shouldn't be doing this. And we asked them, why do you think that this isn't allowed? Like, what rule do you think is being broken here? And one answer was that it's against ethical guidelines for researchers, which we know is, kind of not true, at least if you're considering this in terms of IRBs. A lot of people also thought that it was a violation of Twitter's terms of service, whereas actually in their privacy policy, it's like, hey, just so you know, people like university researchers might be using your tweets. I spoke to an engineer at Twitter a couple of years ago who used to work for GNIP, so is basically in charge of like data collection that often is given or sold to researchers. And I said, hey, how do you think about like the situation where like this is a business model for Twitter, like you're selling this data, but like most people don't actually know that their data is being used this way? And he was like, oh, it's right there in the privacy policy. Like everyone on Twitter definitely knows that researchers are using their tweets. I was like, you are so wrong, and I can give you some data about that. I'm not talking about this today, but I've also done some work looking at data scraping provisions in terms of service, which I can tell you are like completely useless, particularly since people don't read terms of service. So whatever it says in there about whether researchers can use data or not doesn't actually influence anyone's expectations of privacy on the site. But what we were particularly interested in here was what kinds of things influence people's attitudes about this. So for example, do you think that researchers should be able to use your tweets without permission? And most people said no. And they had various ways of talking about why or how. A lot of people wanted to be informed. No, they didn't say consent. They didn't say, I want to be consented. They said, I wanted to be informed. And actually, 80% of the participants said they would want to read the paper if their tweet was in it. Which actually, if my tweet was in a paper, I would totally want to read it. And I think that's probably true, like if I wasn't a researcher. People also cared about things like what the purpose of the study was. whether they would somehow be identifiable in the data, which they certainly may be if it's, for example, qualitative research. And so we asked about a lot of these contextual kinds of factors. And there were some things that obviously bothered people a lot more. So if you look at like the darker shades of blue here, obviously people don't want their tweets collected from a protected account, which mostly is probably not happening because that arguably does not constitute public data. People are also very uncomfortable with deleted tweets being used, which is kind of an open question right now. And people are also more comfortable if the data was a large data set, or it was being analyzed by a computer instead of a person, sort of idea of obscurity. But the point of all of this is that this image is not flat. Like people weren't just like, oh, research is fine. It doesn't matter, how it's being done or who's doing it or whatever. Because I think that these kinds of contexts matter. So data collection decisions should not be context agnostic. It matters what kind of data you're collecting, what you're going to do with it, who you are, what the expectations and norms of the users are. So the idea that it doesn't matter like what the tweet is, I think is a little silly. So this is my first big point that I would love anyone watching this to internalize, which is that publicness is not the only context that matters. And I can tell you, I have read the methods sections of many, many, many papers where the only way that this is addressed is the data was public. And one of the reasons this is a problem is because, and this is a finding from a paper published by someone else a couple of years ago, that 72% of articles in PubMed, which is a health database, that used Twitter data quoted at least one tweet, which led back to the Twitter user 84% of the time. So this is pretty common, right? Particularly if you're doing qualitative analysis, is to include your data in the paper, examples, in a code book, or in your findings, or whatever. And of course, you can take text and put it into the search of Twitter, and find it pretty easily. In fact, there was a case a few years ago where a paper was published that included a code book, and a journalist who was writing about that research put those tweets from the code book into Twitter, found the tweets, contacted the people who tweeted them and said, hey, your tweet was in a research paper, can I talk to you about it? Which in that case actually was not particularly harmful because the paper was about like language on Twitter, like it wasn't anything, that could potentially harm people. But imagine if it was a tweet from PubMed, something about health, for example. So the idea that we would treat a tweet that's like this exactly the same as a tweet that's like this, and this is obfuscated for the same reason. I would rather not share tweets like this publicly, but it's based on a real tweet. These two things are not equivalent, right? And if your only ethical metric is it public, that would suggest that these two things can be treated the same, which means that it would be fine, for example, to quote both of them in a paper. Or, we're seeing a lot of research lately that is creating classifiers based on tweets. I can tell from your social media whether you have a certain mental health condition, for example. You might, therefore, put in a paper a code book that basically diagnoses people in your paper. And imagine the potential harm of finding out that an algorithm thinks you have a mental health condition, for example. And this can be particularly problematic when we're talking about vulnerable communities. So my PhD student, Brianna, did interviews with people who are part of online fandom, which has a large percentage of LGBTQ people. So she talked to them about research ethics for that particular community. And one of the things that we found was that even if the content is not about something obviously sensitive, simply being in a space where you have particular privacy concerns, like for example, you're not out in your real life, means that the potential harm of your content being amplified outside the context where you originally put it is huge. And people told us stories, for example, about how fan artists were really worried about their work being reposted by like BuzzFeed or something, which happens, because what if someone in their real life recognizes their art style and it sends them to their Tumblr where they're out? So these are the kinds of things that matter when you're collecting this kind of data, not just what the content is about, but who created it. And the other thing that matters is what you're going to do with it. So also, if you're collecting content from a particular community to help build an algorithm or technology, where the outcome of that technology could harm that community, like a classifier for whether someone is queer, how would you feel knowing that your content helped like fuel this technology that you think can be harmful? And another example of where the purpose of something really mattered. It's one of our favorite ethical scandals, Cambridge Analytica. So most people think about this as a privacy scandal, but it was also a research ethics scandal, because the original data collection that connected personality tests to Facebook likes was put forth as a research study for science. Here, give us, fill out this personality test and give us access to your Facebook account for science. And if people had known how the model created from that data would actually be used, maybe they wouldn't have done that, right? So the idea that it doesn't matter what you're going to do, with the eventual output of your research, like, doesn't matter. That also seems a little silly to me. And Cambridge Analytica also kicked off a lot of really interesting discussions. One of my favorites was this news op-ed that was published, where the author suggested that part of the cause of this kind of scandal, in addition to other similar sorts of things, and comparing it to ethical reckonings in other fields like collapsed bridges and unethical medical experiments, et cetera, was that software engineers treat safety and ethics as specialties rather than the foundations of all design. And when I read this, I thought, yep, that is exactly the problem that we have here. And what I think it's indicative of is this problem, which is the I'm just an engineer problem. And this is a quote from this particular article that was about someone giving a talk about a predictive policing system. And someone asked about ethics, and the response was, well, I'm just the engineer. This is for someone else to think about the ethical implications. Around the same time, there was a similar situation where there was a Radiolab interview with a researcher who had created technology that took in audio and made very realistic looking video. And the use case they used as an example was President Obama, because there's so much audio. And so, the result of this research is President Obama giving a talk that he never gave. And the interviewer asked, well, the obvious use case of this technology is fake news. So how do you feel about that? And the answer was like, well, I'm sure there are like really smart people who can think about the social and ethical implications of this technology. And the way that I like to think about this is there are people whose job it is, for example, on a construction site, to think about safety. So safety engineer is a job. But that doesn't mean that the person putting up the drywall like walks by a live wire and it's like, oh, well, that's for the safety engineer to think about. Or if they're never shown what a live wire looks like, right? I mean, it is a specialization. I guess I am a specialist in this, but that doesn't mean that it's not also everyone's job to be thinking about. And I would suggest that part of this problem The I'm just an engineer problem is caused by the frequent way that we teach computer science, which is that ethics is a specialization, in part because we often silo it in its own class, as opposed to teaching it as part of technical practice. So that's my other big point here, is that ethics is not just a specialization. So I've been doing some work lately in this area, ethics education and computer science in particular. And in a paper that was published not very long ago, sorry for this really ugly table, it's from the paper, we looked at AI, machine learning, and data science classes in the top computer science programs as defined by US News and World Report. So you are in there somewhere. These are anonymized, but I can tell you that you're one of the better ones. This is good. Go Stanford. So we looked at syllabi and or course descriptions for every class where we could find one. And we coded for whether there was any mention of anything that could reasonably be considered ethics. Like, we were very generous. Like, if you have half a day on differential privacy, you get a thumbs up on this, right? And the vast majority do not. And this includes even like standalone ethics classes. So out of over 100 technical classes in this data set, less than 20 had any mention of ethics. And this is an area of computer science that you would think would be particularly important here, right? Like, we're not looking at like database classes or theory classes or whatever. Like, this is AI, machine learning. And this is something that people have been thinking about for a while. In the mid-90s, the NSF funded a task force to figure out how to do ethics in CS education. So a bunch of smart people came back and said, it should be integrated into every single class. Having a standalone class is good too, and you should do both, but if you can only do one, you should integrate it. And so in 1995 or 1996, they published this in CACM as a recommendation, and the dean of a computer science department wrote a letter to the editor that said, this is a terrible idea because this is not computer science. This thing, it's hard to imagine computer scientists teaching it. Discussing the social and ethical implications of computing is not doing computer science. I would like to think that maybe we're a little more nuanced now. And I would like to think that particularly in the past few years, as we see sort of an increasing number of ethical controversies in the news, that our attitudes towards this are changing. So I'm doing some work in introductory programming classes this semester. I'll talk about some more in a moment. But part of what we did was a pre-survey at the beginning of these classes. We have a mixture of computer science majors, non-majors who are taking a computer science class, information science majors, and also students who are taking a class that does not involve programming to fill a computation requirement. So basically students who actively don't want to program. And we asked them about a lot of things. One of the things that we asked, and this was a response, how much do you agree with the statement that was drawn from the quote that I just told you, discussing the social and ethical impacts of technology as part of doing computer science. The pink here is various shades of agreement. So we saw more agreement for this statement from non-computer science majors. And then relatedly, in my job after graduation, I will have a responsibility to think about ethics. Also saw higher agreement for this from non-majors. And this is not like computer science majors versus philosophy majors. The biggest major in the non-majors is actually advertising. So I'm actually kind of glad that advertising students think they're going to have to think about ethics. That's good. So I think that one way to solve this problem is to integrate ethics throughout the entire computer science curriculum for a few reasons. One is that it emphasizes that it is part of technical practice and not an add-on or a specialization. I think this is important because when you learn, when you take a machine learning class, you should learn that like thinking about the bias in your training data is part of doing it. If you don't do it, you're bad at it. Similarly, when you take an intro programming class and you write your first line of code, you should be thinking about the power that that gives you and the consequences of any kind of technology that is created. I mean, even something like a database class, the fact that the way that you categorize things is something that has inherent power, right? There's always something that's relevant to the impact that any kind of technology that you're going to build is going to have on society. Integrating also avoids isolating ethics from its context so that we can think about how this actually fits into technical practice. And it ensures that everyone who takes a technical class is exposed to ethics content, because not everyone who takes an intro programming class is going to go on to take more, right? Or if you learn to code in middle school, you might not do more. And you can do a lot of damage with a little bit of code, right? Like you think about the potential bad actors from Cambridge Analytica, like there's psychologists, self-taught data scientists, the whistleblower. Sometimes required ethics classes are taught at the very end of your CS degree, and Mark Zuckerberg dropped out. So I think that these things are really important reasons why we should be integrating it throughout. And I have some suggestions for ways to do this. One is, how do I make students care? How do I make them think it's relevant? Like, I actually find it unlikely that you can exist in the news system today and not think that ethics is something that's impacting technology right now, right? I don't actually think it's as hard to make this argument as it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. Another thing that is gaining some traction is creating modules that can be put into different classes in conjunction with experts, like ethicists. This is something that's happening at Harvard. They're embedding philosophy grad students and postdocs into every computer science class to work with instructors. You can include ethical components as part of assignments. What are the ethical implications of this thing that you're building or this thing that you're designing? And also recontextualizing existing assignments to include implicit ethical considerations, and also to start at the very beginning. So actually, it's these last two things that I'm working on right now. So I am helping to embed ethics into introductory programming classes at CU. And one of my priorities was making this as little work on the instructors as possible, particularly for the computer science classes where there's 1,000 students in a semester. So what I did was I took the assignments that they were already doing. Here's the assignment that teaches conditionals, and here's the one that does iteration. And thinking about how to change the assignments so that they would inherently bring up some kind of ethical issue. So we've been working on that, myself and some PhD students in my lab. And these are just little chunks of 2 example assignments. One, so the assignment that was already in a computer science class to teach conditionals was having them create a fortune teller, like how long is your lifeline and here's your fortune. So we redid that assignment so that the problems were very, very similar, but instead it was about serving personalized ads on a social network platform. And so this, I know you're not gonna have time to read this, but this one at the top here is basically a way to tee up a conversation about Cambridge Analytica, about how the ads that you see might not just be, you have a dog, so we're going to advertise dog food. That was the first problem they did. But instead, because you have a dog or because of these other things, we know this thing about you, and therefore the ads that we're going to serve to you are intended to speak to you as the kind of person that you are. Yes.
get them to rehearse the bad behavior?
If we just left it like this, that would be true. But all of this involves conversation around it, and that this is not the way that we should potentially be doing things. Or, I mean, the other thing here is that we're doing this with non-majors as well. And this is a literacy issue. Like, you also need to understand what's happening. And in fact, I've been doing versions of these problems in the non-coding class as well, and like, how do algorithms work? So rehearsing these same kinds of things is like I think you can't critique technology unless you understand enough about how it's gonna work. But you're right, you would absolutely not want to do these things in isolation without the conversation around it. We have another problem where it's based on college admissions data, which these are mostly freshmen, so this is something that's very fresh on their minds. Here are some kinds of things that admissions algorithms might take into account. Build an algorithm that would suggest students based on this data to be considered farther. And then it's taking them through problems where they're finding certain kinds of outliers in order to think about where these kinds of algorithms might fail or where they might provide unexpected or undesirable results. So these are just a couple of examples, and we're working a lot more with this. If you are interested in teaching ethics as part of a class, or if you teach an ethics class, one thing that I have available is a gigantic spreadsheet of tech ethics syllabi that I crowdsourced a couple of years ago. Which you can find here if you want to look. But I have some good news, which is that we've also done some analysis on these syllabi and have a paper that's coming out soon, in addition to a giant database that we have created of all of the readings that are taught in about 115 tech ethics classes. So we've done some very basic analysis on like the kinds of things that are being taught when people teach tech ethics. And one of the things that I'm hoping is that you can see connections between these topics. So these are mostly standalone ethics classes. But you can see connections between these kinds of topics and what could be taught in, for example, a technical class. Another solution that has been put forth, to this computer science ethics, the scandals and how we teach and this sort of thing, is that computer science needs the humanities, and I agree with this. I think that having computer science students trained not only in ethical and social issues in the technical classes that they're taking, but having to engage with the broader curricula around the humanities, et cetera, is really important. Though I'm also not really on board with the idea that like everyone needs to be a computer scientist. I think we're seeing this big push for like STEM, everyone needs to be STEM, which I mean, having more people to fill these jobs, et cetera, is really good. But I also think that it's really important to have even a small amount of computational literacy in order to as I said before, understand technology enough to be able to critique it, or to understand kind of how it's being used on you. So I have been spinning up more work around broadening participation in computing, partly with this kind of goal in mind. I've also been working in the non-coding class that I'm teaching to engage with some more basic computational literacy for the same reason. And all of this is going to come back to this in a moment, I promise. But to tee up the next part, I need to explain something real quick, which is what fanfiction is. Who knows what fanfiction is? Okay, so most of you. This number has raised in the past 5 years that I've been giving talks about this issue. So I've done a lot of work around fanfiction communities, and in particular, this platform, Archive of Our Own. And if you want to read a lot about this, I have a high paper from 2016 about what I think is a really remarkable online platform. And one of the reasons is because it was built by the community that uses it. So fanfiction is, stories about Harry Potter or Captain Kirk. There are other kinds of fan works like art, fan vids, remix videos, and this is not a new thing. This is like the OG user-generated content. I mean, women were creating remix videos of VCRs in the 80s and Star Trek episodes, like before anyone had even thought of YouTube. And this often has involved learning technical skills. And this website was in response to the migration across different fan platforms over time, and the community feeling that none of these platforms serve their needs, or even worse, like were actively working against them, didn't want them there, etc. And so there was this idea that, oh, we should just build our own thing. And today, there are over 5 million works and over 2 million users. It's also, there are a lot of really good design decisions and interesting things on the site around things like inclusivity, accessibility, and lots of very interesting things that come up in part because it was built by the community that uses it. But the thing that's fascinating about this is the demographics of this particular community. So this is some data from a Fanrun census. And I'm showing you this because this was a data set of about 12,000 people. I've done surveys that are more recent that validate this, but they're only like 2,000 or 3,000 people. But this is about standard. They're actually in this, this is mostly archive of our own users, but consider it like transformative fandom. People who write fan fiction, et cetera. I'm not talking about like people talking about Star Wars on Twitter. More people who identify as female than cisgender men, for example, in this particular community. And also, a really a large percentage of people who identify as LGBTQ. And though I don't have data about this, a large number of people with disabilities, anecdotally, in fandom. And these are the people who not only built this archive, but also have engaged in a lot of other kinds of computational projects that were really successful. As I mentioned, the design of Archive of Our Own is remarkable in a number of ways. One is that the search tagging organization system is something that anyone who's building any kind of information organization system should really learn from. Also, they just won a Hugo Award, which is for science fiction, which is and this is a story that I wrote when they were nominated, and I was basically like, this is not only a win for like diversity in science fiction, it's a win for diversity in tech. Because particularly if you compare this community to open source, and this is an open source project, I mean, really remarkable, right? And the other thing is that they had a strong value early on that they only wanted this to be built by the people who used it, like not bringing in outside developers. So as the person who started it told me, oh, we realized we were going to have to grow our own. So the other thing that happened was a lot of people learned to code so that they could help develop the archive. And this is actually something that I had seen anecdotally in fandom for a long time for lots of different types of technical skills. So the developers that I talked to talked about how this process of learning technical skills in order to help on the archive was empowering, that the learning community was positive. Some of them specifically would talk about it in contrast to open source communities that they might have tried to slip into. And I also heard this for people who had learned other kind of technical skills. So for example, one person said that they learned Python so that they could like create a random romantic pairing generator for fanfiction characters. And I heard this kind of story over and over and over. I taught myself these technical skills, or I learned these technical skills in this community of fandom because I wanted to do something to contribute to this thing I loved. And with Archive of Our Own, the way that this was often framed was because I wanted to make a platform that was better for my community, that was more inclusive, and it was safer. So this is one of my more recent projects. So this is recently funded by the NSF, and it is led by my PhD student, Brianna. And what we're doing is looking at different examples of these kinds of computational projects as a particular path towards broadening participation in computing. Not this idea that we're going to like airdrop diversity into a computer science major or a tech company, but instead that there might be other pathways toward computational learning in communities of people that are traditionally underrepresented. And in particular, when the impetus for this is to do something to make their community better, or to increase representation, which actually is a big thing behind the creation of all fan works. For example, if you look on Archive of Our Own, you will see that by far the most common romantic pairings, for example, are not heterosexual. And that there are often stories about bringing more women into a story where they weren't there. Actually, my first fan fiction when I was in high school was like giving the female characters in Star Trek more to do. And this is a pretty common story, right? We've also seen similar kinds of things with disability, writing characters with disabilities into stories in a way that they're not represented on screen. And sometimes this also involves learning technical skills. So one of the areas that we're investigating is video game modding. So learning to code so that you can mod video games to make them more queer or to make them more accessible. And then another example is social platforms for fandom. So you may have heard about Tumblr's adult content ban back in December, and there was a lot of worry about this, particularly given the kind of content that is often central to fandom. And in the work that we've done, particularly around looking at how people move across fandom platforms over time, because some people like started off on Usenet and now they're on Tumblr. Tumblr is not super popular right now, actually, and not even because of this. So I mentioned, going back to the research ethics stuff, people being concerned about researchers and journalists, et cetera, finding fandom data and amplifying it. So the issue with Tumblr is that you can either be all public or all private. So there are two problems that are caused by Tumblr for this particular community. One is the privacy issue. So if you are concerned about being outed, for example, there's no way to like have your content be private just to the people who you want to see it, except for limiting the discoverability of it, which is a problem if this is an important support space, right? So as I said, a lot of people talk to us about, oh, I didn't even realize that, these kinds of communities existed until I stumbled onto fandom, and then suddenly I was able to talk to people who I never could have found in my real life. So if we start making things completely private, then we also limit the discoverability, which limits the benefit of those kinds of support spaces. The other problem is that Tumblr doesn't allow for sub-communities. I mentioned some of my work is around online governance, which often means social norms and other kinds of rules. So it turns out that if a community is completely flat, like Tumblr or Twitter, that, you know what, there are different kinds of people on there who have different kinds of social norms, and when you throw them all into one place, there's conflict. And so if there isn't the ability to create sub-communities, then you're going to see more of that. So for both of these reasons, there's a group in fandom right now building a site called Pillow Fort, which kind of looks like Tumblr and LiveJournal smushed together, which has the same kinds of affordances as LiveJournal, but has granular privacy settings and sub-communities. So we're doing some participant observation there now and are hoping to talk to the people who are building it as well. So it's a preview of some work that I'm really excited about coming up. Now, I promised in the title of this paper that I was going to give you 3 lessons for ethical tech. So in Truth in Advertising, here are my 3 lessons. So one of them is that data is people, and publicness is not the only context that matters when it comes to data. I think that this is something that we should be talking about in terms of, in particular, machine learning ethics in the same way that we're thinking about bias, is the provenance of data and where it comes from. Also, no one is just an engineer. When I wrote the op-ed that I pointed to briefly earlier, the tagline was, if you work in tech and you don't think about ethics, you are bad at your job. If I could wave a magic wand and change something about the culture of the tech industry right now, that would be it, is that everyone is at least thinking about this. I think that that could go a long way. And then that there are a lot of benefits to empowering more people to build and or critique technology. And that we should be thinking about this in part by looking at informal learning spaces where we might be seeing more positive experiences with technology learning than we might see in some other contexts. So to close, I will thank my really awesome research lab. So these are my PhD students as well as some undergrads and a scattered law student in there. Thank you. And there's time for questions. Yes?
One of the things we struggle in the day-to-day is what exactly are we supposed to do, right? If we have something that the main use could be fake news, shall we not doing it at all? The question comes because if we don't do it, someone else, probably bad actor, will do it anyway. So shouldn't we be doing it at least to keep control of what we are doing? I agree with the analogy. From that perspective, I'm fine to say I'm only an engineer, because if I don't do it, I'm sure someone else will do it and will weaponize it. So if I do it, at least I have control of what we're doing. We understand the technology. So the question is, what we are supposed to do if we have a technology that has a potential to do bad things? Shall we stop doing it and let other one that won't care as us, another government? Many governments will do it, or hackers will, easy. So what's the actual course of action you suggest this happen?
Yeah, so you bring up the sort of what do we do problem, which I think is the big one here. So I'm going to answer the question that you gave me, and then I'm going to answer another question that you didn't ask. So, I gave a couple of examples of things that technologies that could have really, really bad unintended consequences. I think the first step is that there should be some recognition for the kinds of consequences, right? So a lot of the examples that I brought up, when confronted with the issue, it was like deer in headlights, right? But if you're thinking about the potential unintended consequences from, the foundations of the design of that thing, there are potentially ways that you could mitigate it, right? So are there ways, so the fake news technology, for example, are there ways that it could be built that would, make it more obvious that it was fake, for example? Are there ways that, one thing that I think about is sharing this technology or sharing data. So for example, do you share the data set from one of the, facial analysis algorithms that can determine someone's gender or sexual orientation or whatever? I think that there are solutions to that as well. For example, in terms of vetting the people who are using it. I don't necessarily know the answers to all of this off the top of my head, but if you're able to anticipate what the problems could be, there might be ways to mitigate it or to make the kinds of negative consequences less likely. So the related question that you didn't ask was, well, what happens when I'm like worker B at a tech company and I think that something bad is happening? What am I supposed to do about it? I think that is also a really big problem and something that we should be talking more about, because I think that part of training responsible computer scientists isn't just like teaching them to be able to spot ethical issues, but then what kinds of things do you do after that? It means learning how to organize, learning how to speak to power, and these I think are really hard things to. So in some ways I have offered you questions and not answers, but the more people who are thinking about the questions, the better. Yes?
Kind of drawing on your law background, do you think it might be useful or productive to regulate this? Because kind of following on that note, researchers are probably not, they might do things like mine public videos for good, and other people, like companies or people who learn to code, the archetype of Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, could be fit for bad in relatively few lines of code. So do you think the law should step in and say, you don't really have a choice here, you have to be ethical?
So the problem is that the law's definition of ethical might be questionable. I am always a little wary of jumping to regulation as a solution, in part because law and ethics are not the same thing. And I would rather people be thinking about ethics than law. So like a really good example of this is the data scraping in terms of service, right? So like my opinion of data scraping provisions in terms of service is that we shouldn't be using them to make decisions in either direction. I can think of circumstances where you might scrape data and it would be completely ethical. I can also think of like unethical reasons that provision might be in a terms of service. And I also think that like not having a provision like that is absolutely not carte blanche to do it. And so, I'm a little wary about jumping to regulation. I do think that in the current way that things are working, which is that right now IRBs are handling most of what people consider research ethics, I do think there might be some benefit then to IRBs being potentially a path to evaluating this kind of thing, just because I don't know what other structure is in place right now. I mean, I would like to think that like I can go around and tell everyone like here are the things that you should be thinking about, and then people would actually do it, but that's just not going to be the case, right? People are also going to disagree about what constitutes ethical. So yes and no, I guess, would be my actual answer to that question. Yes?
So along the IRB, it's historically rearward facing, right? Like they're still worried about injecting people with syphilis. How do you think we can get the IRB to be in front of these issues and be kind of a contributor to the discussion? Like they seem to be worried about yesterday's problem a lot of the time.
Well, so obviously IRBs should be very concerned about injecting people with syphilis.
Yeah,
yes, but like, so one of the problems is that IRBs are set up to like deal with, like that's what they were built for, right? So they've never been particularly good at dealing with social science, and I'm sure many of you are thinking like, oh, IRBs like already have too much. Like they do tend to get kind of ridiculous sometimes because they're not about ethics, they're about compliance. Like, I mean, I tell this to my students all the time because they'll ask me like, oh, do I need to put in an IRB amendment for like this tiny little thing? They're like, when it's obviously not an ethical problem. And I'm like, I know, you're completely right. Unfortunately, the IRB doesn't care about ethics, they care about compliance. So that's actually the reason why I'm a little hesitant to say that they should be the ones to be handling this. So I have a collaborator who's done a bunch of research with IRBs and like how they think about this public data thing. And the answer is like, it's a mess. Like some of them care, some of them don't, some of them are like actively scared of it. This is a vastly inconsistent. To some extent, I think that research communities might be better positioned to do this. But as being on the SIG-Chi ethics committee, which that's what we do, there's so much fear around creating guidelines because of, ethical pluralism for one thing, like who decides what's ethical. And I would say that, so I think the number one thing that we can be doing right now is to be having many more open conversations about this. Because right now, nobody's talking about it, nobody's writing about it in their papers, and so there's no way for the community to form norms. So if I can change one thing right now, it's to people start writing about this in the methods section of their papers. Because then we also get good examples that other people can learn from. Yes?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I think that sometimes we see this divide where when we have this conversation in tech, it's a very reactive conversation of we're gonna do something bad, let's try not to do the bad thing. But I think you also do a really beautiful job of pointing to the fact that actually there are folks in community who are generating, not just sort of reacting to, right? Generating a beautiful version of what privacy should look like or what our data relationships should look like. And I think there's a lot of people in this room that have power to do that generative work, but they leave this talk and they don't know, right? So I'm curious, I guess the two questions are, one, what are the questions that we ask ourselves and our communities to figure out what is the dream, what is the ideal, lovely privacy data situation, and what are some of the answers that you're hearing to that question now?
So I'll give you maybe part of an answer to that. So one of the ways that I'm parsing your question is what are some ways that we can better train people to be able to think through these things and potentially be able to think what a better world could be or how we can mitigate negative consequences, et cetera. So one thing that I think is a skill that we should be teaching technologists is how to creatively speculate, how to think about the future. Recently there was a suggestion that people should start writing about the potential negative consequences of their research in their papers. And one of the critiques to this suggestion was, how am I supposed to know that, right? Which is fair. But I think that being able to speculate about the future is something that we can get better with practice. So I use a lot of science fiction in my teaching and also writing science fiction. So I have this teaching exercise called the Black Mirror Writer's Room that encourages people to think about current technology, take it a step farther, think about the cautionary tale, and then also to think about how we don't get to that future. This obviously isn't going to train us all to be fortune tellers, but I think it's a good skill to practice.